Hello and welcome to this edition of Staying Ahead of the Curve. I'm Jeff Snyder, Vice President with CAMAC Retirement Group, and joining me today is the Executive Director of the State of Washington Department of Retirement System, Director Marcie Frost. Marcie, thanks for joining us on the show today.
Certainly.
When we last spoke about a year ago, the Department of Retirement System was undergoing a planned transition to a new record keeper. And by all accounts, the transition, now we're a year later, the transition's gone really well. You've partnered with the new record keeper Empower Retirement, ICMA RC, and CAMAC Retirement. Wanted to see if you would share your perspective over the last 12 to 24 months on how the transition went.
Certainly. So we, at the Department of Retirement Systems, one of the first considerations we had in selecting a partner record keeper was that their value system really matched the value system of the department, meaning that this was going to be an organization that was as customer focused as our department has been and has been getting better at over the last 5 years. So we did considerable due diligence visits, not just to make sure that they can meet the technical specifications of the transition, but to also make sure that there was good culture alignment. We had been with a record keeper since the inception of the plan, the hybrid plan, in the mid-90s, and that was ICMA RC, who had been a great partner for over 20 years, or almost 20 years. But it was time for us to take a look at the possibility of having a single record keeper. And that was very important as well, because in order for, I think, for people to really pay attention to the retirement, we as the plan sponsor have got to start dealing with the complexity of the plans that we're administering. And the best way that we thought we could do that is to remove some of that complexity by the number of partners that our members were really interacting with.
So at the DRS, you have a very strong mission statement, and I know you hold the members in high regard. You want to take care of them. How did you define a successful plan transition?
So first and foremost, it would be no negative member impact whatsoever. So everything that we had planned out in the scope of the project, success would mean that we were close to hitting those targets and getting through those gates in the way that we thought we would get through the gates. And also understanding that you can't plan for everything and that you have to be able to mitigate risk as it pops up along the way. And we certainly had some of that through the project team, or through the project, but we had an excellent project team in place. And I would say one of the first areas of success for us was making sure you had the right people on the team, not just in the record keeper, but also we don't do transitions very often. So it was very important for us at the onset to find the right partner to also help us identify the right record keeper. So we consulted with the CAMAC Retirement Group, Jeff, and found that that engagement was certainly a part of the
Great. Are there, you mentioned some of the lessons that you learned. Are there other lessons that may be of benefit to other plan sponsors? And I'm not just talking about governmental plan sponsors. I'm talking about all plan sponsors. You've talked about in the past and today about the importance of hitting your mark and dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's. But are there some other takeaways that you can impart upon the viewership?
So communicating with members. So again, for Washington, this was a group of members who had been with the same record keeper for almost 20 years and had a pretty stable, predictable environment that they were interacting with either through the contact center or through the online account access. So member communication ended up being extremely important. And I think there's a balance of making sure that you hit all the legal compliance markers, as well as making sure that you're hitting all the customer satisfaction markers, i.e., are you sending information to people, one, that's actionable, and two, that's understandable. And so we spent a lot of time working with our communications team, the communications team at CAMAC, the communications team at the record keeper, to make sure that the member was receiving information that they could actually take action from, and that it wasn't overly legally complex, and that they wouldn't be able to understand it.
So to that end, can you go into a little bit more detail about that development of the communication? I mean, you mentioned eliminating the jargon and the compliance disclosure information and trying to figure out a way to kind of slim down. Can you talk a little bit more about that communications and education development process? Because that is very detailed and time consuming.
It was, and typically the way the process would work is the record keeper would initiate a draft of a piece of material that needed to go to a member. And I think the other best practice that we learned along the way is the timing of when you send the materials out. You can't send them too far in advance because people tend to act in the moment. We found that about 60 days before an action is due is about the right timing. But also to have editorial privileges over the content, because we have been in the business of the customer member servicing for a very long time, and we also do customer interviews. So we know what the customers are expecting from us as the plan sponsor. The record keeper doesn't necessarily have that type of information readily available. So there was some back and forth on making sure, again, that the member could take action from the material that was being sent to them, that it was understandable, and that anything that was action-oriented was at the front of the communication. And I think one of the things that we really made an impact on was taking the legal disclosures and moving those to the back of the document versus having those be the first thing that a member would read, and really putting the action and the information that was most relevant to the change up front where the member would read that.
So you really applied the tenets of behavioral finance. I mean, you really are, kind of bringing that, what we've all been talking about for many, many years at this point, bringing that in terms of crafting, making sure that the message is very clear to members and that they understand exactly what the takeaway is.
Exactly. Yeah, we call it plain talk. Make it plain and not in the jargon. Now, you mentioned the jargon, and we get into the jargon really very easily in interactions that we have at the department. But members are not interacting in that jargon as often as we are. So we really need to take a step back and say, what does a member really expect and really need from this, and how do we communicate with them in a way that they really understand it?
So it's communicating and doing it in a way that doesn't elevate an issue to cause concern. But really, I think what the takeaway is that if you properly plan and you properly message and you space it out appropriately, that that leads to plan success. And because as long as you're doing the other things behind the scenes in terms of managing the project, everything kind of works itself out.
It does, and then we also set up a special contact center just for the transition, and the people who were working in the contact center in that call were people who were trained more deeply on the transition. So not only would they get the written piece of communication, but if their way of learning about a change was really to interact with a person, they could call the contact center and get information as well.